December 11th, 1941. Berlin. Inside the cavernous, wood-paneled walls of the Kroll Opera House, the air is heavy with the scent of damp wool uniforms and polished leather. Adolf Hitler stands before the cheering Reichstag, his voice echoing through the chamber as he formally declares war on the United States. Among the gathered generals of the German High Command, there is no apprehension. There is only a supreme, fatal arrogance. To the analysts of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, America is a fractured, culturally diluted nation. They look across the Atlantic and see a strictly isolationist population, entirely unprepared for the brutal realities of global conflict. German intelligence reports casually dismiss American manufacturing as hopelessly soft. They conclude that a nation obsessed with churning out refrigerators, civilian automobiles, and razor blades is mathematically incapable of matching the forged, militarized steel of the Third Reich. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy shares this exact delusion, convinced that a single devastating blow will force a weak-willed republic to sue for peace. The Axis powers believe the vast oceans will protect them. But deep within the sprawling factories of the American Rust Belt, an unprecedented, terrifying industrial awakening is already in motion. Yet, in the early months of 1942, this industrial awakening was entirely invisible to the intelligence apparatus of the Axis powers. The German General Staff, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, operated on a rigid, Eurocentric worldview. To them, modern war was a matter of localized blitzkrieg, rapid, decisive campaigns fought by seasoned professional armies. The United States simply did not fit this paradigm. Throughout the late 1930s, German military attaches stationed in Washington, D.C. sent back reports painting a portrait of a nation paralyzed by the Great Depression and deeply entrenched in political isolationism. The passing of the Neutrality Acts and the massive anti-interventionist rallies of the America First Committee convinced Berlin that the American public would never tolerate another bloody entanglement in Europe. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, severely underestimated American manufacturing capabilities because they measured it against their own artisanal, highly specialized military-industrial complex. German weapons were undeniably engineering marvels, but their production relied heavily on handcrafted precision and skilled labor, which made mass production difficult. When high-ranking Nazi officials looked at American assembly lines, they saw a system entirely devoted to civilian comfort. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring infamously assured Hitler that the Americans were fundamentally soft, confidently stating that they could only build refrigerators and razor blades. He scoffed at the idea that commercial automobile plants could be retooled to build combat aircraft, viewing the deeply ingrained consumerism of the United States as a terminal weakness rather than a dormant strength. This fatal miscalculation was heavily reinforced by the physical state of the American military. On the eve of war in 1939, the United States Army consisted of fewer than 190,000 active duty personnel. It was the 19th largest army in the world, ranking just behind Portugal. Axis intelligence agents eagerly gathered photographs of the famous 1940 Louisiana maneuvers, where American soldiers trained with broomsticks acting as rifles and commercial pickup trucks with the word tank painted on their sides. To the battle-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht, who had just swept through France in a matter of weeks, the American military was a theatrical joke. Hitler himself, blinded by ideological fanaticism, dismissed the United States as a socially decayed society, fundamentally lacking the martial spirit required for the rigors of total war. 8,000 miles away, the Japanese imperial headquarters, the Daihonei, succumbed to a remarkably similar strain of strategic myopia. While a few officers who had lived and studied in America harbored a deep dread of waking a sleeping industrial giant, the broader consensus in Tokyo was steeped in the philosophy of Yamato Damashi, the invincible Japanese martial spirit. Japanese intelligence analysts meticulously tracked America's gross domestic product, steel output, and oil reserves, yet they drew the wrong psychological conclusions from the data. They believed that while America possessed vast material wealth, its culturally diverse citizens lacked the spiritual fortitude to endure a protracted, high-casualty war across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Tokyo's grand strategy relied entirely on this assumption of American fragility. The Japanese plan was to quickly seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, establish an ironclad defensive perimeter of island fortresses, and bleed the American Navy dry as it attempted an agonizingly slow push across the ocean. They calculated that after a series of horrific losses, a demoralized American public would force its government to the negotiating table. Both Germany and Japan based their global ambitions on a static snapshot of a peacetime republic. Furthermore, geographic distance bred a false sense of security. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were viewed by Berlin and Tokyo as impenetrable moats. German intelligence planners banked entirely on the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet to sever any logistical lifeline before it reached European shores. They assumed that even if America could produce war materials, it would be physically impossible to transport them in meaningful quantities across hostile waters. They envisioned a war of attrition where the raw tonnage of sunken merchant vessels would consistently outpace American shipyards. This entire doctrine relied on a fundamental underestimation of the sheer, brute force of American industrial mobilization, a mobilization that was about to shatter every known metric of wartime production the moment the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. That shattered metric ceased to be a theory and became a terrifying reality. The dormant, sprawling machinery of the American economy violently snapped awake. On February 1, 1942, less than 2 months after entering the war, the United States government took an unprecedented step. It permanently halted the production of civilian automobiles. Detroit, the undisputed capital of American consumerism, instantly stopped building the very machines that defined its existence. The factory floors were gutted of their peacetime tooling. The Great Conversion had begun, driven by the newly formed War Production Board, which held absolute authority over the nation's raw materials and industrial output. Axis spies, tasked with monitoring this transition, reported back with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They watched as the very fabric of American manufacturing inverted itself. Typewriter companies like Underwood seamlessly shifted to milling M1 carbine rifles. Toy train manufacturer Lionel began stamping out compasses and binnacles for the Navy. Singer Sewing machine utilized its precision tooling to manufacture complex flight instruments and artillery fire control systems. Even corset manufacturers pivoted overnight to stitching heavy canvas parachute harnesses. This was not a slow, bureaucratic mobilization. It was a total societal reorganization executed at LIGHTSPED. Nowhere was this more visible than in the heavy industries of the Rust Belt. On a snowy patch of Michigan farmland, the Chrysler Corporation erected the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant. It was a structure so unimaginably vast that its internal climate occasionally formed its own indoor clouds. Within a year of its completion, this single facility was outproducing the entire combined tank industry of the Third Reich. German military planners, who viewed tank construction as a highly bespoke, specialized craft requiring years of apprenticeship, simply could not comprehend the numbers. When Abwehr operatives smuggled raw production data back to Berlin, the statisticians of the High Command often crossed out the figures with red ink, officially classifying them as crude, impossible American propaganda. The psychological barrier of supposed German engineering superiority prevented them from accepting the mathematical truth. The aviation shift was equally staggering. Ford Motor Company poured its mass production genius into the Willow Run plant, a mile-long assembly line designed specifically for the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. To the Luftwaffe, a 4-engine bomber was a strategic asset requiring months of meticulous assembly. By the peak of its operation, Willow Run was rolling a fully completed, combat-ready B-24 out of its hangar doors every 63 minutes, operating on grueling, around-the-clock shifts. The glow of blast furnaces and welding torches illuminated the night sky from Ohio to Illinois, fueled by millions of women and minority workers who filled the immense labor vacuum left by deployed soldiers. Yet, building the weapons was only half the equation. The materials had to cross the hostile oceans that the Axis believed were impenetrable. Enter Henry J. Kaiser, a dam builder and industrialist who had never constructed a ship in his life. He applied automotive assembly line techniques to the naval dry docks of the West Coast. He championed the Liberty ship, an ugly utilitarian, slow-moving cargo vessel built not for naval combat, but for pure, undeniable volume. German U-boat commanders calculated that it took a minimum of several months to construct a standard ocean-going freighter. Kaiser's shipyards prefabricated the vessels in massive sections, welding them together with unprecedented speed. In a legendary demonstration of this capability, his workers completely assembled the hull of the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. By the end of 1942, the refrigerators and razor blades, the illusion lay completely shattered. The United States was already outproducing all Axis powers combined, and its industrial ceiling was nowhere in sight. A relentless, roaring logistical pipeline had been forged. It stretched from the iron mines of Minnesota, through the roaring foundries of Pennsylvania, down the heavy rail corridors of the East Coast, and directly onto the reinforced decks of thousands of waiting cargo ships. The American war machine was fully awake, heavily armed, and hungry for the front lines. The focus of the war now shifted from the factory floor to the frozen, blood-soaked battlefields where this tidal wave of steel would first crash into the Axis war machine. That collision happened first in the cold, gray swells of the North Atlantic. The early months of 1942 were a euphoric slaughter known as the Second Happy Time. If the math held, Britain would starve, and the American war effort would drown in the sea. But by early 1943, the periscope views began to change. German captains stalking the shipping lanes surfaced to find horizons choked with smoke. Convoys were no longer desperate, ragged collections of tramp steamers. They were massive geometric grids of steel pushing relentlessly through the waves, protected by layers of destroyers and escort carriers. U-boat crews celebrated a successful torpedo strike, watching a freighter slip beneath the surface, only to realize the grim truth of their situation. For every vessel they sent to the bottom, American shipyards were launching 3 more. The mathematical formula of the Tonnage completely collapsed. The U-boat hunters slowly became the hunted, overwhelmed not just by sonar and depth charges, but by the sheer unconquerable volume of Henry Kaiser's Liberty ships. This endless conveyor belt of steel did not just cross the Atlantic. It wrapped around the globe, funneling straight into the bloodiest theater of the war. On the Eastern Front, the German Wehrmacht was locked in a horrific death grapple with the Soviet Red Army. Here, the human angle of America's logistical miracle became a weapon of mass psychological destruction. The standard German infantrymen, the Lanzer, marched into the Soviet Union, believing in the absolute mechanical superiority of the Reich. Yet as the war dragged into the freezing mud of the Russian Rasputitsa, the reality of German logistics was shockingly primitive. Over 80% of the German army relied entirely on horse-drawn carts to move ammunition and food. Millions of horses perished in the snow, leaving German units paralyzed, freezing, and starving at the end of wildly overextended supply lines. Across no man's land, the Red Army was experiencing a very different logistical reality. Through the treacherous Arctic convoys and the Persian corridor, the United States was pumping millions of tons of Lend-Lease aid directly into the Soviet war machine. The impact was immediate and devastating. Entire Soviet divisions were suddenly motorized, riding into battle on the backs of over 400,000 heavy-duty American trucks. The six-wheel drive Studebaker US-6 became the mechanical spine of the Red Army, pulling artillery pieces through thick mud that swallowed German horses whole. For the German soldier huddled in a frozen trench, the signs of this transatlantic lifeline were profoundly demoralizing. When the Wehrmacht managed to overrun Soviet positions, they could not just find Russian equipment. They pried open captured supply crates to find millions of tins of American Spam, which the Soviets jokingly called Roosevelt sausage. They found American telephone wire connecting Soviet command posts. They found Soviet pilots flying aircraft fueled by millions of tons of high-octane American aviation gas, wearing boots stitched in Massachusetts. The psychological toll on the Axis frontline fighter was catastrophic. Berlin propaganda continuously assured them that the decadent Americans were thousands of miles away, isolated and ineffective. Yet, the physical evidence of American industrial supremacy was literally feeding and mobilizing the very army grinding them into the snow. The German soldier realized, long before his commanders in Berlin, that he was not just fighting the Soviet Union. He was fighting the combined, untouched industrial might of the cities of Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland. While the frontline troops suffered the immediate, physical despair of facing an infinitely supplied enemy, a different kind of terror was beginning to infiltrate the highest echelons of Axis intelligence. Deep inside the subterranean concrete bunkers of Zossen, the analysts of the German Oberkommando der Wehrmacht were staring at a mathematical impossibility. By late 1943, aerial reconnaissance over southern England and intercepted Allied logistics traffic revealed a terrifying, inescapable picture. The Americans were not merely sending armies. They were transplanting entire cities of steel, rubber, and high explosives across the Atlantic. Armaments Minister Albert Speer, tasked with squeezing every ounce of production from a heavily bombed, overstretched German industry, began reading intelligence estimates with a growing sense of doom. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, struggling to replace seasoned pilots and highly engineered airframes. Meanwhile, the American 8th Air Force was absorbing staggering, horrific losses over heavily defended industrial centers like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, only to return weeks later with even larger, fully reinforced armadas of B-17 flying fortresses. The high attrition rate that German intelligence had heavily relied upon to break American civilian morale was simply absorbed by the sheer scale of stateside assembly lines. The arsenal of democracy was no longer just a political slogan. It was a physical death sentence hanging over the Third Reich. Half a world away, the Japanese Imperial Navy was experiencing an even more profound technological shock. Tokyo's grand defensive strategy relied on a fundamental centuries-old rule of naval warfare. Fleets require massive, established port facilities to repair, refuel, and rearm. The Japanese High Command calculated that, if they controlled the major deep-water ports of the Western Pacific, the United States Navy would be permanently tethered to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast thousands of miles from the front line. They believed the vast empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean was their ultimate impenetrable weapon. They were catastrophically wrong. This intelligence failure stemmed from a complete inability to imagine that military infrastructure itself could be mass-produced, packaged, and exported. When American forces assaulted Japanese-held island fortresses, they did not just bring infantry and artillery. They brought the United States Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees. Japanese garrison commanders watched the aftermath of American landings in absolute disbelief. A runway that took Imperial engineers months to carve out of the dense jungle using hand tools Woven baskets and forced labor was frequently neutralized by American bombing. But when the Americans took an island, the Seabees hit the beaches driving heavy diesel bulldozers, mechanized graders, and carrying thousands of tons of interlocking pierced steel planking, known as Marston mat. Working relentlessly under sniper fire and tropical downpours, they transformed shattered coral reefs into operational bases. Within 72 hours of securing a hostile beachhead, a fully functional all-weather airstrip was launching American fighter patrols. The Japanese tactical timetable, which relied heavily on the slow, agonizing pace of jungle warfare, was entirely obliterated by this mechanized terraforming. Yet the most devastating revelation for Japanese naval intelligence was the American solution to fleet maintenance. After brutal naval engagements, Japanese spies operating in neutral ports anticipated that heavily damaged American capital ships would be forced to limp 5,000 miles back to California for major repairs. This would effectively remove those warships from the theater for up to a year. Instead, the United States Navy simply towed the shipyard to the combat zone. They deployed the Advanced Base Sectional Docks, or BSDs. These were colossal multi-section floating dry docks, constructed in separate pieces in the United States, towed across the Pacific Ocean, and welded together in secure, deep-water anchorages like Ulithi Atoll. These floating behemoths could literally lift a 100,000-ton, heavily damaged battleship entirely out of the water in the middle of the ocean. Shipwrights working around the clock under blazing floodlights could patch massive torpedo holes, replace shattered propellers, and send a capital ship back to the firing line in a matter of weeks rather than months. Japanese submarine commanders, who had definitively reported American cruisers sunk or severely crippled in battle, were horrified to look through their periscopes months later and see those exact same vessels steaming back into combat with fresh paint and upgraded radar arrays. Axis intelligence had prepared for a traditional war of static borders, fortified strongpoints, and capital city conquests. They had not prepared for an adversary that industrialized the very concept of power projection. The Axis had bet their entire empires on the rigid assumption that American logistics would snap under the immense strain of a two-front global war. Instead, as 1944 approached, that supply chain was not only holding, it was preparing to unleash the most concentrated, overwhelming projection of force in human history. By the spring of 1944, the island of Great Britain was physically groaning under the weight of American industry. Was an undertaking of such staggering proportion that a popular joke among American G.I.s claimed only the barrage balloons tethered to the coast were keeping the island from sinking into the sea. The idyllic English countryside was transformed into an endless, camouflaged labyrinth of steel and high explosives. Narrow country lanes were choked with tens of thousands of olive-drab Studebaker trucks, Willys Jeeps, and M4 Sherman tanks. Artillery shells were stacked in the forests like cordwood, stretching for miles under thick canopies of netting. Over 1.5 million American troops were staged across the country, requiring an astonishing 16 million tons of supplies, just to sustain their presence before a single shot was fired in France. Across the English Channel, the analysts of the German Oberkommando der Wehrmacht knew an invasion was imminent. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the Atlantic wall defenses, stared at the maps of the French coastline with a grim, mathematical certainty. They based their entire defensive strategy on an ironclad law of military logistics. To supply a mechanized army of that size, the Allies absolutely had to capture a major deep-water port intact. The disastrous Allied raid on Dieppe in 1942 had proven how heavily fortified and fiercely defended these harbors were. German intelligence concluded that the Allies would strike either at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route with immediate access to massive port facilities, or perhaps Cherbourg. The German plan was brutal but logical. Deny the enemy a harbor, and their invasion force would quickly starve on the beaches, running out of ammunition and fuel within weeks. The German High Command was confident that even if the Americans managed to establish a shallow beachhead, the English Channel itself would act as the ultimate bottleneck. Standard deep draft freighters could not simply dump Sherman tanks and thousands of tons of rations onto the sand. The offloading process would be agonizingly slow, easily disrupted by bad weather, and highly vulnerable to Luftwaffe strafing runs or U-boat attacks. The Wehrmacht planned to hold the ports, contain the beachhead, and use their superior interior railway lines to rush panzer divisions to the coast, driving the lightly supplied Americans back into the sea. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the Allies punched through the Atlantic Wall at Normandy. The initial shock of the Armada was profound, but within the bunkers of the German High Command, a desperate lingering optimism remained. They immediately ordered the thorough demolition of the port facilities at Cherbourg. They believed the clock was now ticking. The Americans were on the beaches, but without a harbor, the invasion would inevitably suffocate under its own weight. But then, the Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots returned with photographs that completely shattered the German tactical reality. In the days following D-Day, strange, massive geometric shapes began appearing off the coast of Arromanches and Omaha Beach. German intelligence had previously spotted these enormous, 6-story high concrete blocks under construction in British shipyards, but they had dismissed them as anti-aircraft towers or odd coastal defense emplacements. They were profoundly, fatally wrong. These were the components of the Mulberry Harbors. In an act of engineering audacity that defied every assumption of Axis military doctrine, the Allies had built their own ports in pieces, floated them across the turbulent English Channel, and sank them precisely into place. Massive hollow concrete caissons, codenamed Phoenixes, were aligned to form artificial breakwaters miles long, were secured to the seabed on giant spud legs that raised and lowered with the massive Norman tides. The Americans were not waiting to capture a port. The realization that washed over the German High Command was one of sheer, unadulterated panic. The strategic bottleneck they had banked their entire Western defense upon did not exist. By mid-June, the Mulberry Harbors were fully operational, completely bypassing the ruined docks of Cherbourg. German generals watched in horror as intelligence reports poured in. Every single day, a relentless, uninterrupted conveyor belt of American Liberty ships docked at the artificial pier heads. They were offloading up to 7,000 tons of supplies and 500,000 gallons of fuel every 24 hours directly onto the sand. The logistical constraints that had governed European warfare for centuries had been obliterated by American industrial brute force. The Wehrmacht found itself facing a monster that never slept, never starved, and possessed an endless, terrifying artery of steel flowing directly from the factories of Michigan straight to the hedgerows of France. Half a world away, in the sweltering war rooms of Tokyo, the Japanese Admiralty clung to a rigid, mathematical hope born of a similar geographic delusion. The bedrock of Imperial Japanese naval strategy was the doctrine of Kanta-Ikessen, the decisive battle. For decades, Japanese planners had modeled a war where the United States Pacific Fleet would be forced to cross the vast, empty expanse of the Central Pacific. They calculated that without major, secure naval bases, the American Armada would suffer severe logistical attrition. By the time it reached the Philippine Sea or the Marianas, the fleet would be tethered to the limits of its fuel bunkers and empty ammunition magazines, ripe for annihilation by a rested, locally supplied Japanese force. Japanese intelligence assumed a modern fast carrier strike force could operate continuously for perhaps 3 or 4 weeks, before requiring a mandatory withdrawal to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. They wielded distance as their ultimate weapon. But Admiral Chester Nimitz and the commanders of the Pacific Fleet were no longer fighting a war of static geography. They were fighting a war of mobile infrastructure. The instrument of Tokyo's undoing was officially designated Service Squadron 10. To the uninitiated, Servron 10 was an unglamorous, sprawling collection of auxiliary vessels devoid of heavy armor or main battery guns. In reality, it was the most destructive logistical weapon ever deployed in naval history. Servron 10 was a massive floating city that simply followed the combat fleet across the ocean. It consisted of hundreds of specialized ships, fleet oilers, ammunition tenders, hospital ships, refrigerator vessels, floating dry docks, and heavily loaded cargo freighters. In the suffocating heat of the Pacific summer, thousands of miles from the California coast, the United States Fifth Fleet did not retreat to resupply. They resupplied in motion. Through a highly choreographed and incredibly dangerous ballet of seamanship known as underway replenishment, the American logistics chain defied the laws of traditional naval warfare. Destroyers and cruisers pulled directly alongside massive fleet oilers, steaming parallel at 15 knots through choppy swells. Heavy steel cables zipped across the churning water, transferring hundreds of thousands of gallons of heavy bunker crude and aviation fuel. Simultaneously, cargo nets hauled tons of 5-inch artillery shells, replacement aircraft engines, and fresh rations directly into the magazines of combat-ready warships. The psychological and tactical impact of this mobile pipeline was profoundly devastating. When Japanese reconnaissance pilots broke through the cloud cover over the Mariana Islands in June 1944, they expected to find a weary, depleted American task force operating at the extreme edge of its endurance. Instead, they looked down upon an armada of over 500 ships that had been fighting in hostile waters for weeks without a single operational degradation. The American fleet was not shrinking. It was growing. The ensuing Battle of the Philippine Sea became the ultimate bloody testament to this logistical supremacy. The Japanese launched waves of naval strike aircraft, expecting to catch a localized, exhausted enemy. Instead, they crashed into an impenetrable wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire and swarms of heavily armed F-6F Hellcat fighters. The sky filled with burning metal in a catastrophic slaughter that American pilots grimly dubbed the Great Marianas. Turkey shoot. The Japanese carrier fleet was permanently broken, losing the core of its naval aviation in a matter of hours. But the true climax of the engagement was not just the destruction of Japanese air power. It was what happened after the smoke cleared. Following a massive high-intensity engagement that would have forced any other navy on Earth to limp back to a home port for rearmament, the American fast carriers simply pulled back over the horizon. They rendezvoused with the floating warehouses of Cervon-10, gorged themselves on fresh aviation fuel, loaded thousands of new bombs, brought aboard replacement aircraft, and returned to combat operations the very next morning. The sheer audacity of American supply lines reached a level that bordered on the surreal. For a Japanese infantryman dug into the coral of Palaliu or Saipan, surviving on a handful of moldy rice and captured rainwater, the realization that his enemy possessed a dedicated transoceanic supply chain just for frozen desserts was the ultimate psychological shatterpoint. It proved that the United States was operating with a surplus so massive it defied rational comprehension. The Japanese defensive perimeter, meticulously planned over decades to exhaust an advancing enemy, violently collapsed. The island fortresses of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell in rapid succession. The vast distances that Tokyo relied upon to protect the home islands had been completely neutralized by a mobile supply chain of unprecedented scale. By the late summer of 1944, the intelligence analysts in both Tokyo and Berlin finally understood the horrifying reality of their situation. The oceans were no longer defensive barriers. The American industrial machine had effectively paved the Atlantic and the Pacific with uninterrupted highways of steel. With the logistical floodgates permanently wedged open, the conflict ceased to be a contest of tactical maneuvering and evolved into a brutal mathematical certainty of Axis destruction. That mathematical certainty fell heaviest not on the intelligence officers in Berlin or Tokyo, but on the frontline Axis soldier fighting in the shattered ruins of Europe. By the autumn of 1944, a German panzer grenadier dug into the mud of the Siegfried Line experienced a profound, crushing sensory shift. The sky, once proudly dominated by the Luftwaffe, now vibrated constantly with the relentless drone of Allied fighter bombers. But the true, paralyzing terror came from the ground. It came from the American artillery. American gun crews were firing with a volume that completely defied standard German military doctrine. A typical Wehrmacht artillery battery was strictly rationed, ordered by high command to fire only at confirmed, high-value targets due to severe crippling shell shortages. Across the front line, American batteries operated with no such constraints. They executed time-on-target barrages devastating, synchronized strikes where hundreds of shells from widely dispersed locations were mathematically calculated to arrive on target at the exact same millisecond. American gunners fired not just at visible enemy formations, but at suspected coordinates, empty tree lines, and quiet crossroads, simply to deny the enemy movement. They were actively spending massive quantities of industrial steel to save human blood. To the German soldier on the receiving end, it felt as though the Americans possessed an infinite magazine. And in a practical sense, they did, sustained by an improvised logistical miracle known as the Red Ball Express. Following the explosive Allied breakout from Normandy, the advancing armies of George S. Patton and Courtney Hodges sprinted across France faster than the ruined French railway network could support them. To bridge this rapidly expanding gap, the United States Army implemented a massive continuous truck convoy system. Manned predominantly by African-American quartermaster troops, the Red Ball Express transformed the cratered, narrow roads of northern France into a one-way high-speed loop. Nearly 6,000 heavy cargo trucks operated 24 hours a day, driving through the night with tape over their headlights to avoid aerial detection. They pushed through exhaustion, mud, and mechanical failure to deliver an astonishing 12,500 tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations to the advancing front lines every single day. As these American trucks roared eastward in endless dust-choked columns, the retreating German army presented a tragic, anachronistic contrast. Elite SS Panzer divisions, once the terror of Europe, were forced to abandon state-of-the-art Tiger and Panther tanks on the side of the road simply because they had completely run out of diesel. German infantry marched in ragged, exhausted columns alongside requisitioned French farm horses, pulling wooden carts filled with meager, rotting rations. The highly vaunted German war machine was physically starving, choking to death on its own severed supply lines. Post-war interrogations of captured German soldiers revealed a recurring demoralizing theme. It was rarely the tactical brilliance of Allied generals that broke their martial spirit. It was the sheer vulgar abundance of American logistics. A famously recounted anecdote involved a captured German officer who broke down in tears not upon surrendering his weapon, but moments later when he was handed a freshly baked slice of white bread from a mechanized American field bakery operating just miles from the active combat zone. The profound realization that his enemy possessed the excess fuel, flour, and transport capacity to bake fresh bread, while his own hardened veterans froze and starved, shattered the last remaining illusions of Axis supremacy. This psychological collapse on the muddy battlefields of Europe was merely a symptom of a much larger, systemic failure. The raw industrial numbers that Axis intelligence had so arrogantly dismissed as crude propaganda years earlier were now actively dismantling their empires, city by city. By the spring of 1945, those numbers formed an inescapable, suffocating ledger of defeat. They read like the output of a planetary industrial harvest, and an astonishing 6,500 naval vessels. The nation once ridiculed for producing only civilian comforts had armed not only itself, but also Great Britain, the Soviet Union, Free France, and nationalist China. Once the highly efficient pulse of the Reich was utterly paralyzed by relentless, round-the-clock Allied bombing campaigns. Albert Speer, the architect of the German war economy, German manufacturing had been driven deep underground, desperately assembling highly advanced, complex weapons like the V-2 rocket and the Mi-262 jet fighter. The skies over a ruined Berlin belonged entirely to armadas of American heavy bombers machines, built in the safety of the American Midwest, maintained by parts shipped across a firmly secured ocean and flown by crews who possessed infinite reserves of aviation gas. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating precision, had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force. Rubber and basic foodstuffs was systematically sent to the bottom of the ocean by American submarines and relentless aerial mining. Yet, mere miles from the Japanese coastline, the United States military operated with an abundance that bordered on the surreal. The final brutal amphibious assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa were supported by a logistical tale so massive that American supply ships were literally queuing up in the open ocean. Off the coast of Okinawa, an armada of over 1,400 ships gathered, forming an iron ring that reached the horizon. The fast carriers of Task Force 58 launched thousands of sorties daily, their magazines perpetually replenished by the floating warehouses of Service Squadron 10. Watched as the Pacific Ocean itself transformed into a heavily armored, floating American metropolis. They had assessed the United States strictly on its peacetime posture, failing completely to calculate the terrifying exponential velocity of a fully mobilized democracy. Instead, they were slowly, methodically crushed under the treads of a logistical juggernaut that essentially paved over their empires with infinite, uninterrupted supply chains. When the fires of the Second World War finally burned out, the grand intelligence bureaus of the Third Reich and the Japanese Empire had been reduced to ash. In their wake, they left a profound, undeniable lesson about the true nature of modern warfare. History often romanticizes conflict as a grand clash of brilliant tacticians, daring fighter aces, and the raw, unyielding courage of the frontline soldier. And while the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific saw unimaginable human sacrifice, the fundamental architecture of Allied victory was not built solely on bravery. It was forged in the deafening, unglamorous roar of the American Rust Belt. The Axis powers built their global ambitions on the myth of the invincible warrior. They treated logistics as an administrative afterthought, a menial chore beneath the dignity of their deeply ingrained martial ideologies. They fatally failed to understand that in a fully industrialized world, valor without supply is merely a delayed execution. The United States, by contrast, elevated the supply chain to a supreme instrument of war. The nation countered fascist fanaticism with relentless mass production. It fought deeply entrenched military empires with liberty ships, floating dry docks, and endless dusty convoys of olive-drab trucks. The ultimate victory belonged to the clipboard and the crane as much as the rifle. It belonged to the millions of women riveting bomber fuselages in Michigan, the Seabees laying steel airstrips on hostile coral reefs, and the merchant mariners navigating freezing U-boat-infested waters to deliver the mathematical certainty of Axis defeat. Today, the rusted hulls of sunken freighters and the quiet, overgrown airfields scattered across the Pacific stand as silent monuments to this monumental undertaking. They serve as a lasting reminder of the greatest strategic intelligence failure of the 20th century. The Axis powers looked across the oceans and saw a divided, consumer-driven nation fundamentally incapable of enduring a total war. Instead, they awakened an industrial titan that did not just outfight their armies, but completely buried their empires under an unstoppable, infinite mountain of steel.